G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Acts. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian walk. Thank you. So we're back into the book of Acts, and we're looking at Acts chapter 24, verse 22 to 25, verse 22. Now, several weeks ago, we ended up where Paul is in the Antonia fortress, which is on the edge of the temple compound, and his nephew brings news of a plot to kill him. Now, Lysias, the chief captain, he gets Paul out of there, and he decides to send Paul up to Caesarea. He sends a couple of soldiers with him, about 470 soldiers actually with him, to guard him from this band of men, 40 of them who have decided they're going to kill Paul. And so they take him to Caesarea for his protection. Paul up there, he comes before Felix, who is the procurator. He comes before Felix to present his defense. And while at this time Ananias, the high priest, and the elders down in Jerusalem, they've now come down with Tertullus, their mouthpiece, their attorney, and they present a whole lot of false charges to Felix. Paul's defense is, listen, I've only been 12 days in Jerusalem. I went there to worship, not profane the temple. I haven't been stirring up any seditions, as I haven't had enough time to start a rebellion down there. In fact, the Jews of Asia who brought these accusations, they're not even here before you, Felix, to make their accusations before you. Paul says, all I've been doing down there is preaching the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I'm guilty of no crime against Rome or anyone else. He says, my conscience is clear. And that's where we're up to today. So let's continue on. Let's see the results of his meeting down here. Now, in verse 22, but we see in verses 22 and 23, we see the termination of the proceedings. In verse 22 of Acts 24, we have, but Felix, having more exact knowledge concerning the way. Remember, the way is how they talk about this new movement. In other words, Felix had knowledge of this new faith. He had even more knowledge of the new faith than Tertullus. Remember, Tertullus was the mouthpiece, was the legal mouthpiece for the Sanhedrin. We don't know the source of this knowledge or how Felix gained this knowledge, but it is obvious here that the charges against Paul were not proven in accordance with Roman law. Remember, they're only interested in anything that is against Roman law. So Felix deferred the charges, and the word here, deferred them, means he put them off from one. So he's delaying the charges here. It's a Greek word which we see here. Now, Felix adjourned the hearing against Paul without making a decision. He's a bit of a procrastinator, I guess. And he said, when Lysias, the chief captain, comes down, I will determine your matter. Remember, Lysias, the chief captain, he was the guy in charge down in Jerusalem. He was the one who rescued Paul from the mob. So this is obviously a delaying tactic by Felix to get the Jewish accusers to leave Caesarea and go back home, because he has nothing to charge Paul with. Lysias was never actually sent for. It was just a ploy on behalf of Felix to get these guys to go back. And in fact, Lysias was not even needed to settle this case, because remember, Lysias had already declared Paul to be innocent of any charges on the Roman law, and all he did was he sent a letter down with Paul to Felix and say, listen, this is the situation. Now, in verse 23, we have Paul's imprisonment, and so he gave an order to the centurion that he should be kept in charge or kept on the guard, and he should have indulgence. Now, Paul, even though he was in prison, he's not actually in the common prison. He's actually in the palace. So he had a large amount of freedom of movement in the palace, even though he was chained to a soldier. The guards were changed every 6 hours. So guess what? Every 6 hours, Paul had somebody new to tell the gospel to. Not bad. A captive congregation there. Now, so even though Paul was on the guard, he was not under any strict confinement. The centurion was ordered not to forbid any of Paul's friends, for instance, from visiting him. So Paul had full freedom to receive his friends. He had full visitation rights. And this liberty given to Paul shows that Felix, he doesn't believe Paul to be a dangerous criminal at all. And also, he's not forgetting that Paul is a Roman citizen. So he really can't have him on the charge in prison without a charge. In verses 24 to 26, we have the account here of Paul and Felix. In 24 and 25, we have Paul's witness to Felix. And the occasion is found in verse 24. The time was after we have this unknown number of days. So by this time, the Jewish accusers, they've had enough of hanging around. They've gone back to Jerusalem. And Felix now comes with Drusilla. Now, who's Drusilla? Drusilla was his third wife. She was a Jewish woman. She was the youngest daughter of Agrippa I. The other two daughters of Agrippa I were Mariamne and Bernice. So Drusilla was the sister of Agrippa II. Lots of Agrippas there. She was first married to a guy called Aziz. He was a king of Emesa, a little state in Syria, and she got married when she was about 14 years old. Later on, she was convinced to leave Aziz and marry Felix at around about the age of 16. And she bore Felix a son named Agrippa. Now, when Felix and Drusilla arrived, he now sends for Paul. And the reason was that he wanted to hear from him concerning faith in Jesus Christ. Now, we know that Felix already knew some things about Jesus, but he and Drusilla, they simply wanted to know some more stuff about Jesus. What's this all about? Just a little bit of background here. Drusilla's family were quite involved with the way on several occasions, because first of all, her great grandfather, he was the one who tried to kill Jesus in Bethlehem, back in Matthew 2. Her great uncle killed John the Baptist and mocked Jesus, and in Acts 12, it tells of her father, Drusilla's father, killing the apostle James. So she has an idea of the way. In verse 25, it says there we have Paul's message to Felix and Drusilla. And as he reasoned, so Paul reasoned to them of three things. And this is Paul's way of sharing the good news of Jesus with them. He reasoned to them, first of all, of righteousness. And, he knows his audience here. Because Felix had no personal righteousness in either his public or private life. Secondly, he witnessed to him of self-control. Again, Felix was a lustful man with 3 evil marriages. So self-control is not one of his strong points. Third, he also spoke to him concerning the judgment to come. Now, Paul gave Felix and Drusilla 3 compelling reasons why they should repent and believe in Jesus Christ. Paul pointed out that Felix would be judged for failure in these 2 areas, righteousness and self-control. Felix would be judged for a lack of righteousness and for a lack of self-control. And so what we see here is that he is preaching the gospel and he's bringing their sin before them. Obviously, even though Paul is a prisoner, Paul is not afraid to speak the truth to one who actually has the ability to have him killed, but he's not holding back. He's giving it all he's got. Now, in verse 25, it says that the results on Felix, it says Felix was terrified. His fear was genuine fear. And what does that show? It shows that Felix was on the conviction. The Holy Spirit was convicting him of his sin and of judgment. However, he was not willing to turn from his sin. And his cop-out was, listen, he says, go your way for this time. Felix wanted to hear no more at that time. And his claim was, when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. But this was simply an excuse. He did not like the application of Paul's message to himself, and he procrastinated. He continued seeing Paul, but no longer to hear the truth of the gospel, because he doesn't like to hear the fact that, first of all, that he's a sinner, and secondly, that he's going to be under judgment. And in verse 26, we read of Felix's hope, because Felix's true motivation was that he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. Literally, the text reads here, at the same time also hoping. So he was hoping that money would be given to him. And this again highlights to us and shows his failure in those two areas of righteousness and self-control that Paul mentioned. He failed in the area of righteousness. Why? Because he wanted a bribe to dispense justice. He wasn't a fair judge. He wanted a bribe to dispense justice. And he failed in the area of self-control because this shows that he was a greedy man. He was a greedy man. He had a greedy character, because he was hoping that at some point that Paul would give him a bribe. Wherefore also he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. He wanted a bribe, so he more frequently called Paul in on the pretext of wanting to know more about Paul's fate. He was hoping that Paul would get the hint and say, listen, Felix, listen, my friends have brought some money along from my supporters. How about if I just give you a few dollars and let me go? But Paul simply never did. He never got the hint, or if he got the hint, he just ignored it completely. And the word hoped here, where it says, that he hoped, that Felix hoped, is in the present tense, which means that he kept on hoping that Paul would pay him something. Just how much can you pay me, Paul? And the word sent for him is also in the present tense. So what it means is that Felix kept on sending for Paul and kept on hoping that Paul would get the hint and give him some money, give him a bribe. Yeah. At some point in all these discussions, Felix lost his fear, and he was therefore destined for the judgment to come, of which Paul warned him, because he'd lost his fear. And then finally, we see in verse 27, we now see the transfer from Felix to Festus. Now, this time was after 2 years were fulfilled. So that's the length of time that Paul was imprisoned here in Caesarea. And this was 2 years under Felix. And the promised second hearing with Lysias, it never came. After 2 years, Lysias never made the trip up to Caesarea. Why? Because he's never ever sent for. And this shows us that that Felix never intended it to take place. Now, finally, what we see here is the change came, and Felix was now succeeded by Porcius Festus. Felix was deposed by Emperor Nero in AD 59 or 60. So this is the time frame that we're in here. Remember, Christ was crucified in AD 30. This is now 59 or 60. Felix has now been deposed. Porcius Festus is now taking over. Now, what caused Felix's what caused him to be deposed is that what happened was that a bit of a fight broke out between Jews and Gentiles in the marketplace of Caesarea. And what did Felix do? Felix sent his soldiers in, and they killed many of the Jewish people. And as a result of that, the Jews made a formal complaint to Nero, and Nero then recalled Felix to Rome, and he was replaced by Festus. We don't know much about Festus because he's very seldom mentioned in any historical records. But three things we do know about Festus. First of all, we know that he was appointed by Nero in either AD 59 or 60. We know he was a procurator until AD 62, and we know that he died in office. That's it. Now, Paul's state is described, it says, and desiring to gain favor with the Jews. And this gives the reason here for Felix's conduct. The Jews had filed a complaint against Felix causing his recall. Therefore, Felix did not need to antagonize the Jews any further, so he left Paul in prison. He just left him there. He didn't want to stir the Jews up anymore. And the Greek word for desiring to gain favor means to place down or to deposit a favor with, to do something to win a favor. And what we see here is that as a result, Felix left Paul in bonds. He left him in chains under confinement in the palace. And this was the deposit that Felix left to gain favor with the Jewish leaders. Now, it's not unusual for new procurators who generally undertook when somebody new comes in, back in that time, they would do a quick disposal of the cases their predecessors left behind. And so often prisoners were released. But with Festus's coming, there was the prospect here that Paul's case would soon find a favorable resolution. But that wasn't going to happen, because remember, Jesus says that, you're going to speak to kings. So, he's got to go down to Rome, speak to Caesar yet. Now, we see Paul's defense before Festus in chapter 25, verses 1 to 12. And we have the visit of Festus to Jerusalem. So in verses 1 to 5 of chapter 25, in verse 1, we have Festus. He's now turned up. He's come down, replaces Felix, and he now goes to Jerusalem. Festus, therefore, verse 1, Festus, therefore, having come into the province. So literally, the Greek says, having set foot upon his province. And the province of, this is a province of Judea at this time. This was a section of the larger province of Syria. So Judea was just a smaller section of the larger province of Syria. And the province of Syria was under a legate. The province of Judea was under a procurator. So a procurator is below a legate. Now, we see therefore. What's the therefore for? What's the therefore? Well, because of the reason for which he began his procuratorship, he now felt it was necessary, this is Festus, to make an immediate trip to Jerusalem. The timing was he gets in and after 3 days. So he gets into the province and boom, 3 days later, down to Jerusalem. And what we see here is that it literally means on the third day with a day of rest in between. That's how the Greek reads. So it's then that he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. He went up because it is always so in going to Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem or you come down from Jerusalem. That's how the Jew writes anyway. So now, question is, this Festus, why does he have to all of a sudden race off down to Jerusalem? Why did he have to go to Jerusalem so quickly? Caesarea was the capital of Judea for the Romans, but Jerusalem was the capital of Judea for the Jews. So Festus thought it was necessary, therefore, to make his trip to Jerusalem and begin his relationship with the Jewish leaders. Remember, the reason he is there is because the Jewish leaders complained to Nero about what Felix did. So, they do have some sway with Nero. So he just wants to make sure that he has a smooth transition here. It says, verse 2, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they besought him. Here we go. We have a new ruler coming in, and the first thing is, hey, you got a guy called Paul. We need to deal with him. So, in verses 2 to 3, the Jewish leaders now make a request of Festus. And the Jewish leaders, remember the Jewish leaders, what are they? They're the 24 chief priests who are Sadducees and the principal men of the Jews. So literally the Greek says the first men, right? So these were the leading men of the city. And later on, and we're going to see in verse 15, these same men are referred to as the elders. So this means that they are the Pharisees of the Sanhedrin. So what we see here is that their request being made to Festus, they were together as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So both lots, Pharisees and Sadducees, which made up the Sanhedrin members, they informed Festus against Paul. So what do they inform Festus about? This was a renewal of the charges against Paul. And this is after 2 years. It must have boiled away within him for the last 2 years, because couldn't wait to tell Festus about Paul. You'd think that their anger would have subsided after 2 years, but actually it hasn't. It's still burning away. They could not get their way with Felix, and now they're hoping to get their way with Festus. And their request to Festus was, it says, they besought him, which means that they kept at him, they kept on beseeching him, kept on begging him, please, send Paul down to us. We need to talk to Paul. We need to find some more information from Paul. And what were they doing? Verse 3 says they're asking a favor against him, that he would send them to Jerusalem. Why? Because they're laying a plot to kill him on the way. So they asked this favor for themselves, but against Paul. And their implication here was that Festus could immediately, listen, Festus, you're new in the area. Let me tell you what you can do. If you grant us this request, straight away, we'll have good relationships. You and I, Festus, we'll get along. Us Jews and you will get along really well if you do this favor for us. And the favor they're asking is that they would send Paul from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Why? They wanted this done for their own secret motive. Remember, they plotted against him once before. Remember that there's 40 guys, they're still living, by the way. They didn't die from starvation. They plotted against him once again. And they would lie in wait to kill him along the way. That's what they were going to do. They were going to set an ambush. That's what it means, plotted, set an ambush. So this is the same type of plot that was hatched earlier by the 40 plus conspirators. We want him, if you send him down to us from Caesarea to Jerusalem, we'll deal with him down here. He'd never get there because they would have ambushed him on the way. Now, in verses 4 to 5, we have the refusal of Festus. And in verse 4, he spells out what he would do. Howbeit Festus answered that Paul was kept in charge at Caesarea. So Paul was already imprisoned in Caesarea. And what he's saying is, listen, there's no need to bring him to Jerusalem. It says he himself was about to depart for Caesarea shortly. So Festus, down in Jerusalem, he's down there on his visitation. He says, listen, I'm going to go back to Caesarea very shortly. I'm going to go back up there, and I'm going to hold court in Caesarea, and I'm going to go back there very shortly. So no need to worry. Caesarea is where Paul will be tried. And this response of Festus foiled the plot of the leaders in Jerusalem. They didn't get their way. And in verse 5, he tells them what they must do. He says, let them therefore, saith he, that are of power among you, go down with me. And if there's anything amiss in the man, let them accuse him. Therefore, what's it therefore? In light of his decision in verse 4 not to bring Paul to Jerusalem, but the whole court in Caesarea, the men of authority or the Jewish leaders of the Sanhedrin must go to Caesarea. You see here the Greek word for amiss that we see here. If there's anything amiss in the man, it means that if there's anything out of place in him, if there's any wrongdoing within Paul. Now, the point of verse 5 here is that the Jewish leaders must go down to Caesarea and they must repeat their charges down there against Paul. Again, notice the way Luke writes here. He writes like a Jew. It says going up to Jerusalem and goes down from Jerusalem. Typical Jewish frame of reference terminology. From Jerusalem, one always goes down. Whether you're a Jew or Gentile, it's always written that you're going down from Jerusalem. Jew, that's the way a Jew writes. That's the way a Jew talks. All right. We have the trial before Festus. Verse 6 describes a journey back to Caesarea. The time in Jerusalem was when he had tarried among them not more than 8 or 10 days. So this was a get acquainted trip, and that was plenty of time to get acquainted down there. And in verse 6, second part of verse 6, we have the convening of the council. So the timing was on the next day after returning from Jerusalem, he sat upon the judgment seat. Now, it says when he sat upon the judgment seat, this now gives legal formality to the trial. Once you sit on that judgment seat, it's now legal trial. It gave legal backing to the trial. And what he now does is he commanded Paul to be brought before him. So he's sitting in the judgment seat. He now calls for Paul. When he was come, the Jews that had come down from Jerusalem stood round about him, bringing against him many and grievous charges which they could not prove. So here we have the charge. The timing of the charge was, this is verse 7, was when Paul was brought forth. Now the source of the charge was the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem. These are Paul's accusers here. They now assume a threatening posture because what they're doing is, the way it's written here, is that they're surrounding him both physically and with their accusations. These were the Jewish leaders of the Sanhedrin. So you can imagine, here's Paul standing there before the judgment seat, and these Jewish leaders, they're virtually surrounded him with their presence and with their accusations. It's very intimidating for normal people, not for Paul there. So this time they had no Latin lawyer like Tertullus. They're on their own, and so what they did was that they massed their numbers now to impress Festus. All these guys are there. At least 24 of them are there. So there it says this leadership. So they're using their numbers to impress Felix and say, listen, look at all of us here. We must be right. Might is right. Oh, I think I've doubled up there. Okay. So what we see here is that they brought against Paul many grievous charges which they could not prove. So all these charges they bring against him, they're bearing down on him, and they issued here the same charges as what Tertullus did back earlier on, but then they added a few more. However, the problem remained the same, is that they could not prove their charges. Remember, these were all made up charges. But what they did was they used constant repetition in place of evidence. They didn't have evidence, so what they did was they just kept repeating the same things. Now, while Paul said in his defense in verse 8, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I sinned at all. So we have Paul's defense here. Paul's declaration was that I have not sinned at all. And then he gave specifics. First of all, he says he had not sinned against the law of Moses. He had broken no Jewish laws. Second, he had not sinned against the temple. He did not profane the temple. Remember, this was the original accusation by the Jews from Asia when they saw him down there with, I forget who the Gentile guy was, but they saw him down in the temple with this guy, and they just assumed, oh, he's taken him into the temple. He took a Gentile into the temple. He didn't do it at all, and that was the Jews from Asia. That was their beef against him. Third, he said, I've not sinned against Caesar. Why? Because I didn't get in and stir up a revolution. I didn't try to start a revolt. So what he's saying is, I'm innocent of all of these things you're bringing against me. I didn't violate any Roman law at all. But Festus, desiring to gain favor with the Jews, answered Paul and said, will you go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? So in verse 9, Festus now sees that there are no provable charges. So he makes a suggestion to Paul. And the reason he made this suggestion is stated first up. It says, Festus desired to gain favor with the Jews. So this was the exact same statement made of the Jews in Acts 24:27. In other words, within 2 weeks of being there, he quickly developed the same fearful respect to the Jewish leaders that Felix possessed. He was intimidated by them, and so he desired to gain their favor, so he made this suggestion. He asked whether Paul was willing to move the trial to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Notice again, a person always goes up to Jerusalem. This is Luke writing. And this also gives us a little bit of insight into Roman law, because Festus could not make Paul move the location from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Festus, even though he was the boss down there, he could not force Paul to make a change of venue for the trial. Paul was a Roman citizen, and it was purely Paul's choice. Festus can't force him. Festus said, and there be judged before me concerning these things. So this last phrase here, it shows us that Festus had by this time, he'd surrendered to the pressure from these Jewish leaders to bring Paul back to their stomping ground, back to Jerusalem. He saw that there were no grounds for condemning Paul under Roman law. However, it was not to Festus's advantage as procurator to release Paul. He couldn't do that, because if he did that, he'd become offside with the Jews. Although releasing Paul was the proper thing to do, proper course of action, Festus did not want just a change of venue. He was trying to avoid doing his Roman duty. When he says before me, the implication is that the implication he desires to give is that in Jerusalem, he says, listen, you want to go down there and be judged before me. The implication he's giving here is that he would be the one that Paul would be giving his defense before in Jerusalem. But more likely, once Festus brought Paul to Jerusalem, he would be turned over to the Sanhedrin, and Festus would only be present as an onlooker. If Festus were not willing to give Paul justice in Caesarea, he would even be less likely to do so in Jerusalem. Furthermore, the journey to Jerusalem would expose Paul to an ambush, which had been plotted twice already. One plot of which Paul was very much aware, that was by his nephew. This situation led Paul to the action which he now takes. And we see in the next slide, in verse 10 to 11, we have Paul's response. And in verse 10, Paul points out the proper place of judgment. Paul said, I am stand at Caesar's judgment seat. I'm standing at Caesar's judgment seat. Paul was a Roman citizen standing before a Roman tribunal. Festus was Caesar's representative. He was the one to judge. He was sitting upon the judgment seat. Therefore, Festus could give a verdict to the case at that very moment. And this is where Paul should be judged. Paul literally says, where I must be judged in Caesarea, because Caesarea is the seat of Roman authority in the land, and that's the proper place for me as a Roman citizen to stand trial. He had done no wrong to the Jews, and therefore there was no need for him to be tried by the Jews. There is no basis for turning Paul over to them in Jerusalem. Festus knows that Paul has done nothing wrong either on the Jewish law or on the Roman law. In verse 11, if then I'm a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if none of those things is true whereof these accuse me, no man can give me up unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. So here we have in verse 11, the issue here is one of guilt or innocence. If I'm a wrongdoer, if I'm in the habit of doing injustice, Paul is saying, he makes 2 points. First of all, if he is guilty, if I am guilty, then I'm willing to die. And the way it's written in Greek is it's a first-class conditional sentence, meaning that it is a condition assumed to be true just for the argument. That's all. Paul says, he says to Festus, for the sake of the argument, assume that I'm guilty. If I'm in the habit of committing anything worthy of death, this is what he's saying. If I do these things habitually, then if I've committed a single case worthy of death, assuming it's true, for the sake of the argument, then I'm willing to die. That's what he's saying. He says, Paul is saying, I'm willing to pay the supreme price. I'm willing to die if the accusation was true. If it is true, then Festus can pass the sentence of death right now, then and there, and get it over and done with. That's what he's saying. But what he says here, but if none of these things, if none of these things is true whereof these accuse me, no man can give me up unto them. So I'm appealing to Caesar. Paul should not be turned over to the Jewish leaders since the charges cannot be legally proven, even less so since Paul was a Roman citizen. And the phrase we see there, unto them, indicates that if Paul were taken to Jerusalem, he would not be tried by Festus, but he already knows that he would be tried by the Jewish leaders. He would be turned over to the Sanhedrin. And he says, no way, you can't give me up onto the Sanhedrin. I'm a Roman citizen. I should be tried before you. You're the Roman seat of authority here. I should be tried before you in Caesarea. Not going to do it. I'm going to appeal to Caesar. And we see his appeal to Caesar in verse 11. Now, this appeal, I appeal unto Caesar, this is a technical phrase, and it's a right given unto Roman citizens from around about 559 BC. It could be called upon. You could make this call after a sentence was given or before a sentence was given. And what it did was it guaranteed further investigation. If you're not happy with the way things go, you say, I'm going to appeal to Caesar, and then the appealer would then be transferred to Rome, and the emperor would give the verdict. So this statement by Paul legally removed the case out of the hands of Festus. And in verse 12, we have the decision of Festus. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, when he spoke with his advisors, he says, you've appealed unto Caesar shall you go. However, bit of a problem now for Festus. He had refused to acquit Paul out of fear of the Jewish leadership. Paul had appealed to Caesar, so he must send Paul to Caesar. Problem is, he's got no charge. Now he needs to formulate some sort of a charge against Paul for Caesar, but he had no charges for Caesar against Paul. Paul was innocent. Festus should have simply declared him to be innocent, and he failed to do that. And Festus now has a problem, and the problem we're going to see in the next section. We're going to see him coming before Agrippa. Paul had defended himself. Paul, verse 13. Now, when certain days were past, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and saluted Festus. So Paul had defended himself before two procurators, and now he's going to go before a king. So he's working his way up the ladder. And in verses 13 to 22, in preparation for Paul's defense before Herod Agrippa II, we have the private explanation. In verse 13, it begins with the visit of Agrippa and Bernice. And after some days, the Greek word means to come between in intervening days, after some days. Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived and saluted Festus. Now, this is Agrippa II, who was the son of Agrippa I. Remember, Agrippa I was the guy who murdered James the Apostle in Acts chapter 12, and he was the guy who locked up Peter. He was a half-brother of Drusilla, who married Felix. We just got rid of Felix and Drusilla. Educated in Rome, very sympathetic to Roman policies. When his father, Agrippa I, died of, remember, worms ate his insides out. He was only 17 years old at that time. He was not appointed to any office at that point. But in AD 48, he was made the king of Chalcis, which was a small province in northern Palestine. And this is why Luke calls him a king. Later on in AD 53, what he did was he exchanged his small kingdom for the tetrarchies of Philip and Lysanias. This is a bit of background about him. Also, he was given authority by Rome over the Jewish temple. And by having authority over the Jewish temple, he also had the right to appoint high priests, which would have really upset the Jews. And in this position, he angered the Jews in two ways. First of all, what he did down in there was he built a palace which overlooked the temple compound. They didn't like that. And they didn't like his palace. And second, he angered them because he frequently changed the high priesthood. Remember, under Mosaic law, the high priest remains in office until he dies. But this guy kept changing the high priesthood to the ones who suited him the best. Now, 3 years later, in AD 56, Nero added several cities and villages to his domain around the Sea of Galilee, and he made his capital in Caesarea Philippi. This is Agrippa, and he changed the name of the city to Neronius after Nero. And what happened was when the Commonwealth of Israel fell in AD 70, what he did was, he returned to Rome, where he spent the rest of his life. And he from history, he said he died childless in the year AD 100, and with his death, that ended the family line of the Herods. No more Herods after him. Okay. Now, Bernice, she comes along as well. Who's Bernice? Well, this is an incestuous mob. This lot. Bernice, like Drusilla, they were both sisters of Agrippa II. And after the death of her first husband, there's a bit of a mistake in your slide there. After the death of her first husband, she got married to her uncle, who was the king of Chalcis. And when he died, she went to Rome to be with Agrippa. Agrippa is her brother, who was still in Rome at that point. And she had an incestuous relationship with him at that time. She then left to marry Polemon, who was the king of Cilicia, which is the province from which Paul came. Now, when Agrippa II became king, what she do? She left her husband to live once again incestuously with her brother Agrippa II. And later, she carries around a bit, this woman. Later on, she left to become the mistress of Vespasian and Titus, who were father and son. Agrippa and Bernice came now to come to salute Festus. They came to pay their respects to the new procurator in the land. That's what they come down for. So what they did was they stayed in Caesarea for an extended period in which Festus now discussed Paul's case with the king. Felix had left Paul there. Remember Felix? previous guy had left Paul there to gain favor with the Jewish leaders, but Festus needed a specific charge before sending Paul to Rome because he's appealed to Caesar, and he had no charge. So he has a problem. There's a certain man left here by Felix. I don't know what to do with him. In verse 15, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, asking for a sentence against him. So in verse 15, Festus is recounting the request the Jewish leaders made of him earlier on. And he refers to the time when he was in Jerusalem earlier on in verse 1. And he says the chief priests and the elders of the Jews, meaning the Sanhedrin, informed him, and this goes back to verse 2 of chapter 25, and they asked for sentence against him. Verse 3 of chapter 25, they wanted me to pass sentence against Paul, to whom I answered that it is not the custom of the Romans to give up any man before that the accused have the accusers face to face and have had opportunity to make his defense concerning the matter laid against him. So this is what he told the Jews. So Festus now tells Felix that he refused their suggestion. Festus answers to the Jews, which we see here is just a bit of an elaboration of verses 4 and 5 of chapter 25. He explained to them that it is contrary to Roman law to turn a man over before the accused meet the accusers face to face. Can't do that, not under the Roman law. And the accused had the right to face his accusers. Also, the accused had the right to make his defense. So Paul had the absolute right to respond to the charges against him. When therefore they were come together here, I made no delay, but on the next day sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought. So he's just recounting what he did to Agrippa. So Festus tells Agrippa about the trial. When they'd come together in Caesarea, it didn't waste any time. The very next day I came back here, I sat on the judgment seat, and I got Paul to come before me. And in verse 18 to 19, what we see here is Festus tells Agrippa the charges of the Jewish leaders. But he points out here, listen, these are the charges of the Jewish leaders. But he says, there's no violation of Roman law. He says, when the accusers stood up, which describes the events of verse 7, the result was failure. They brought no charge of such things as I supposed. There was nothing, what he's saying is, there was nothing punishable on the Roman law. And what when a Greek says brought charges, it meant, the Greek means that they kept on bringing the same charges. They kept on repeating the charges. They probably figured if we repeat it long enough, he'll believe them. And the Greek word here for suppose, where he says I suppose, it means that Festus had continuously been thinking all the time, because this guy was in prison in Caesarea. He was thinking all the time that Paul was guilty of some really evil thing on the Roman law. But now Festus says that simply wasn't true. He says he's guilty of nothing. He says, what am I going to do? He says here in verse 19, he said what the whole issue was. He says, but they had certain questions against him of their own religion, and of one Jesus who was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So what we see here in verse 18, the issue was not Roman law at all. In verse 19, the real issue was Jewish law, and the issue was not Roman law, but points in Judaism, their own religion. And the most pressing issue that he says was the issue of resurrection. And the content of the issue was this man called Jesus. The Jewish leaders contended that he was dead, but Paul affirmed him to be alive. And what we see is the bottom line of this entire debate was the resurrection of Jesus. Was Jesus alive or was he dead? That's the whole thing. I preach Christ crucified, says Paul, but he preaches him resurrected here as well. And in verse 20, Festus told Agrippa of his suggestion to Paul. He says, listen, and I being perplexed how to inquire concerning these things. So that what he says is the reason he said, the reason I made this suggestion, because I was perplexed. I couldn't answer these questions. What he was saying was, I'm unfamiliar with questions of Jewish law. This was the given reason. This is the given reason he's telling Agrippa. So the given reason is that he was unfamiliar with Jewish law. He had no ability to question Paul concerning these issues. If that's the case, why then did Festus wish to continue the case by transferring it to Jerusalem? If he already had determined that no Roman law had been broken, he should have just released him. But see, that wasn't the real reason. The real reason is the reason given earlier in verse 9. He wanted to win over the favor of the Jewish leaders. That's the real reason. So desiring to win over the favor of the Jewish leaders, the suggestion he made was whether Paul was willing to go to Jerusalem. Notice that Festus did not say that he would do the judging in Jerusalem, only that he would have sent Paul to Jerusalem for judgment. Now, Agrippa would understand the matter more clearly. Festus knew that Agrippa would know that the Sanhedrin would handle the matter once taken to Jerusalem. And at that point, in verse 21, Agrippa was then told of Paul's appeal to Caesar. But when Paul had appealed to be kept for the decision of the emperor, this repeats what we saw back in verse 11. And the Greek word here for emperor is a word called Sebastus, which is a Latin name for Augustus. It means the revered one, not revered one. It was originally a name taken by Octavius Caesar, and it was used by later emperors as a title. That's what we're using here. So what we see here is that because of Paul's appeal to Caesar, Festus commanded him to be kept until he could send him to Caesar. And in verse 22, we're told of his decision. Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. I wish to hear the man myself. And it means I'm also wishing to hear him, it says. So Agrippa surely knew things about the new faith. He may even have heard some things about Paul as well. And he points out that he had desired to hear about Paul himself. And when Festus heard this, he says, fantastic, I could be off the hook here. So he wasted no time in organizing it for Agrippa. Festus told Agrippa, tomorrow, you'll see him tomorrow. I'll make sure you see him tomorrow. Let's get this over and done with, and you can deal with it for me. And that is our lot for today.